Hi, my name's James Cooper, and back in '78, I worked search and rescue in the Grand Canyon. I'd been at it for over a decade, and I'd seen just about everything: lost hikers, sudden storms, and even mountain lion encounters. But there was one night out there that I've never been able to shake, and I doubt I ever will. This story isn't easy to tell, but maybe it's time to put it out there, like some kind of exorcism. It was December. Winters are usually mild in Arizona, but that year, an unexpected snowstorm hit the Grand Canyon. The park had been closed for days, and only the essential personnel were left behind. I was in my cabin when the call came in. It was late, close to midnight, and the storm was raging outside, wind howling like a pack of wolves. My radio crackled to life, and a voice came through. At first it was faint, mixed with static, but it got clearer as I adjusted the frequency. "This is James," Cooper, the voice said. "I'm in trouble. I need help. It's dark and I can't see anything." There was a strange pause, and then it whispered, almost like an echo, "Please help." I froze. The voice was my own. I could have sworn it was me. The exact pitch, tone, everything. It was as if I'd called myself, but I hadn't touched the radio, and no one was out there. My first thought was that someone was messing with me, some prankster who'd recorded my voice and was playing it back to spook me. But the more I listened, the more I felt unsettled. It didn't sound like a recording. It sounded desperate, real. My hand shook as I picked up the radio. "Who is this?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. For a long moment, all I could hear was the wind screaming outside. Then, just as I was about to write it off as static interference, the voice returned. "James, please, help me," it pleaded, and then it began to sob. I took a breath, grabbed my flashlight and jacket, and decided to check it out. The storm was fierce, whipping snow into my face as I made my way toward the trailhead where the calls usually came through. As I walked, I kept hearing faint echoes, soft, like someone just out of earshot. "James. James. Help." I followed the voice, each step leading me deeper into the canyon, further than I intended. The snow made everything look strange, like a ghostly landscape. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting as my flashlight cut through the darkness. Then, out of nowhere, my radio crackled again. "This is James Cooper," it said, mimicking my earlier call with chilling accuracy. But this time there was a second voice. It was a woman's, quiet but panicked, and it said, "James, I'm scared. Where are you?" I recognized that voice. Sarah, one of my team members. But she was supposed to be back at base. We'd all bunkered down before the storm hit. No reason for anyone to be out here. I pressed my radio. "Sarah? Is that you? Where are you?" Silence again. Just the wind howling, snow crunching underfoot. I scanned the area, shining my flashlight around, but all I saw was white, endless white, and shadows. Then, I saw something moving in the distance, a figure, barely visible through the snow. They stood still, facing away, shoulders hunched as if they were cold or hurt. I raised my flashlight, and as the beam landed on the figure, it turned. My heart skipped a beat. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. Same face, same clothes, same everything. But it was wrong somehow. The eyes, they didn't blink, just stared right through me, unblinking, cold as death. I stumbled back, and the figure tilted its head, almost like it was studying me. Then, it spoke in my voice. "James, help me. Please." I turned and ran, feeling its gaze burning into my back. The snow made everything disorienting, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My boots crunched through the fresh snow, breath coming out in heavy clouds. I glanced over my shoulder, and it was still there, gliding after me. As I ran, more voices joined in, calling my name. "James, please, help us." They came from all directions, overlapping, creating an eerie symphony of echoes. And every voice sounded like someone I knew: Sarah, other rangers, even my own parents who'd passed years ago. I reached a clearing and found myself surrounded. Figures stood in the distance, barely visible in the blizzard, but I could feel their eyes on me. They all had my face, staring at me with hollow expressions, mouths moving silently as they whispered my name. One of them stepped forward, reaching out with a hand that looked just like mine. "James." You left us," it whispered. The wind seemed to carry their whispers, looping them around me, a chorus of my own voice begging for help. It was like the canyon itself had swallowed me, trapping me in this nightmare of echoes and shadows. Just when I thought I'd go mad from the sound, I saw headlights through the trees. Another ranger was out there, searching for me. I stumbled toward the light, desperate, barely able to keep my balance on the icy ground. The voices grew louder, more insistent, reaching a fever pitch as I neared the headlights. Just as I got close, one last voice cut through the rest, so sharp it felt like a knife to my ears. "James, don't leave us." I turned to see my own face again, standing at the edge of the clearing, expression twisted in a strange, pleading look. I felt frozen, locked in its gaze. Then, the headlights grew brighter, and I forced myself to look away, stumbling forward until I collapsed. I woke up back at base, surrounded by my team. They'd found me just in time, dragged me back through the storm. I tried to tell them what happened, but no one believed me. "Just storm-induced confusion," they said. But I know what I saw. I heard those voices, saw those faces. And to this day I still hear them sometimes, late at night. Echoes of myself, calling from somewhere deep in the canyon, waiting for someone to listen. My name is Dr. Maya Rodriguez, and I've worked as a fire ecology expert for over 15 years. What I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of 2024. I've never shared it outside of a few close friends, and even they don't know everything. I was leading a team through the Pacific Northwest, studying the impact of one of the worst droughts in recorded history. The forests had been parched for months, the rivers reduced to a trickle, and the animals. Well, most had vanished, moved on, or died in search of water. It wasn't uncommon for me to find dried-up carcasses along the way. There was a heaviness to the air, a suffocating stillness that made me feel like I was walking through a graveyard. I remember the morning it all began clearly. We'd set up camp just outside a burned patch of forest near the Columbia River Gorge. It was only about 10 a.m., but the heat already pressed down on us. My two field assistants, Ben and Kelly, had gone to collect samples from the scorched pines while I stayed back at our makeshift base, logging data. That's when I first saw it, a thin, wispy mist creeping through the trees. Now, mist isn't that unusual in the Northwest, but in the middle of a drought. That was strange. Stranger still, the mist wasn't white or gray. It was red, a dull, rusty color, like old blood mixed with smoke. I brushed it off at first, thinking it must have been some illusion caused by the heat or dust in the air. The sun glared down, making the red haze look even darker, almost solid. It lingered near the edge of the forest where Ben and Kelly had gone. As the minutes ticked by, I found myself watching it, unable to shake an uneasy feeling. Then, over the static of the radio, I heard Ben's voice crackle through. "Hey Maya, have you seen mist around here?" I froze. I hadn't mentioned the mist to anyone yet. "Yeah, actually. It's kind of hanging around by the trees," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Okay, good," I thought I was. "Imagining things," he said, his voice shaky. There was a pause, and then, in a quieter voice, he added, "It's moving." A cold prickle ran down my spine. "What do you mean, moving?" "It's following us. Every time we step back, it comes forward. Like it's go—" The radio cut out abruptly. I tried calling back, but only static replied. My heart raced as I stared at the mist. It seemed thicker now, more defined. The edges weren't blending into the air anymore, they were sharp, almost as if it had a form of its own. Finally, I couldn't stand it. Grabbing my equipment, I headed towards the last place I'd seen Ben and Kelly disappear. The underbrush crackled under my feet as I went, and the smell of smoke and charred wood filled my lungs. It felt like walking into a dead world. Then, I saw them both standing completely still, staring into the mist. They looked pale, transfixed, like they were under a spell. "Ben!" "Kelly," I shouted. They didn't respond, just kept staring. As I got closer, I saw why. The red mist wasn't just floating aimlessly. It had formed shapes. Vague, shifting faces and limbs reached out, twisted, and then disappeared back into the haze, like souls trapped in some otherworldly fog. And they were whispering. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sound was unmistakable, a low, mournful chant that grew louder as I approached. It felt like the forest itself was speaking, its grief and anger seeping into every corner of my mind. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was drawn forward, step by trembling step. Then the mist shifted, and suddenly it was surrounding us. The faces grew sharper, more defined. I could make out individual features, expressions twisted in agony. I looked at Ben and Kelly, and for the first time I saw pure terror in their eyes. Maya, it's like it knows us, Kelly whispered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to tell her that she was imagining things, but I couldn't. Deep down, I felt it too. The mist. It did know us. It knew we were part of the scientific community that had studied, documented, and analyzed the forest's decline without truly understanding or respecting it. It knew we'd come to observe, to dissect, but never to help. Run, I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We bolted. The mist seemed to pulse, shifting as we sprinted through the charred remains of the forest. The whispers grew louder, angrier. I don't know how long we ran, maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time felt distorted, stretching and compressing in the red haze. Then, just when I thought we might have outrun it, the mist appeared in front of us, cutting off our path. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving, heart pounding. Ben looked back, eyes wild. Maya, what do we do? I didn't know. Every logical thought had abandoned me. The mist swirled, thickening into a dark, ominous cloud. Shadows stretched and twisted inside it, their faces more anguished, their whispers now almost a scream. We have to go around it, I said, though the words felt meaningless. There was no escape, but as we turned to move, I saw Kelly freeze. Her eyes widened, and she looked back at us with pure horror. Maya, Ben. It's in my head. She clutched her temples, shaking her head as if to dislodge something. Her eyes darted back and forth, but they weren't focusing on anything. Kel, what are you talking about? Ben shouted. It's showing me things. All the destruction. The pain. It's like it's a part of me, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The mist swelled, pressing closer, its tendrils reaching out, wrapping around her like vines. I could see her shaking, struggling against an invisible weight, her face twisted in agony. No, Ben yelled, lunging forward, but the mist blocked his path. He stumbled back, gasping as it wrapped around his ankles, pulling him down. I grabbed his hand, trying to pull him free, but it was like he weighed 1,000 pounds. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the mist began to recede. It slithered back into the trees, leaving behind only a faint smell of smoke and decay. I watched it disappear, my chest heaving, heart still racing. When it was gone, I looked around. Ben was on the ground, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. Kelly, she was gone. There wasn't a trace of her, just silence and the lingering scent of burning. We stumbled back to camp, numb and terrified. I wanted to believe that what we'd seen was some kind of heat-induced hallucination, a trick of the mind. But when we filed our report, the Forest Service quietly dismissed it. They didn't want anyone else to know what we'd encountered out there. To this day, I don't know what that red mist was. A curse? The vengeful spirit of a dying forest? All I know is that it took Kelly, and it left us with the echoes of her last, terrified scream. And sometimes when the wind blows just right and the air is thick with the smell of smoke, I swear I can hear the whispers again, calling me back into the trees. My name is Dr. Nikolai Petrov, and in 2015 I was part of a small research team stationed at a remote Siberian outpost. I was sent by the Moscow Institute of Geology to study permafrost melting patterns, a tedious job, but critical. There had been more than a few strange stories from other researchers stationed in the far north, but I'd always dismissed them as the product of overactive imaginations or the inevitable fraying of nerves after weeks in the frozen tundra. But that year was different. It was the warmest winter on record, and we'd observed more ice melt than in the previous 10 years combined. The region was unpredictable, our instruments constantly picked up anomalies we couldn't explain. Even our local guides, Yakov and Misha, who had lived their entire lives near the tundra, grew visibly uneasy as the days passed. They would exchange nervous glances and whisper under their breath in hushed Russian, words like unnatural and forbidden. We were a close-knit group: Anton, our geologist Lena, a biologist specializing in ancient microorganisms, and Yakov, our expedition leader. Misha, the youngest of the team, was Yakov's nephew, just 19 and strong as an ox. And then there was me, Nikolai Petrov, permafrost specialist. I thought I knew the ice and snow better than anyone. But that winter, I learned that no one truly knows what lies beneath Siberia's permafrost. On the night it all began, we were nearing the end of a 12-hour workday. The winds howled outside, and the station lights flickered in and out, the power struggling against the harsh conditions. Yakov was talking to Anton in the corner, his voice low and urgent, his gloved hands gesturing at a section of our satellite map. "We need to check this spot," Yakov was saying. "The ice melt is faster here than anywhere else." Anton nodded, though he looked unconvinced. I could feel the room's tension thickening with every word, and against my better judgment, I joined them at the table. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though the uneasy look in Yakov's eyes made it hard. Yakov pointed to a point on the map. "This section here," he said. "Misha and I have been watching it. There's something unusual." "Unusual how?" I asked, leaning over to get a closer look. Yakov shook his head slowly, searching for the right words. "There's something under the ice, and it's coming closer to the surface every day." Normally I would have laughed it off, but the look in his eyes stopped me. I followed his gaze to the spot he indicated, a patch of ice not far from the research station. It wasn't a large area, but it was clearly melting faster than the rest, unusually fast. We were scientists, after all, so we did what scientists do. The next day we went to investigate. It was an hour-long trek across the frozen tundra to reach the site. Even in our heavy coats, the bitter cold seeped through, biting at any exposed skin. The landscape was desolate, a vast white wasteland stretching in every direction. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the snow, the wind, and the occasional crack of ice. When we reached the spot Yakov had marked, we couldn't believe our eyes. There, under the rapidly thinning ice, was the outline of something massive. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a perfectly preserved, angular structure that looked like it was straight out of an ancient history book. The ice was melting around it, forming a pool of dark, frigid water. "Is it a building?" Lena whispered, her breath misting in the air. "No way," Anton replied. "This shouldn't be here. This region was uninhabited for thousands of years." But the structure was unmistakable. It was as if some ancient civilization had carved out a building from solid stone and buried it in the permafrost. We could see edges and angles, perfectly preserved walls that looked eerily modern, though they were clearly ancient. We tried to radio back to the station, but the connection was faint and full of static. It was as if the air itself was resisting us, the thick cold pressing down on us, deadening our voices and dulling our movements. Yakov looked at me, his face pale. "We need to take samples." Reluctantly, we began the process. Lena carefully scraped at the edge of the ice, collecting fragments and test tubes. Anton ran his gloved hand over the ice, tracing the lines of the structure below. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were disturbing something best left alone. That night, we returned to the station, our minds buzzing with excitement and dread. We all felt it, an unspoken sense of unease, like we'd awoken something. And then, things started happening. It began with Lena. She came into the common room that night, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. "Nikolai," she whispered. "I just saw myself. At first I thought I'd misheard her." "What do you mean?" She swallowed, glancing over her shoulder. "I was walking back from the lab, and I saw someone in the hallway, standing there. I thought it was Misha. But then they turned around, and it was me, Nikolai. I saw myself." The room fell silent, each of us exchanging uneasy glances. Yakov crossed himself, muttering under his breath. Even Anton, who was usually skeptical of anything unscientific, looked shaken. "We're all tired," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This place does strange things to people's minds." But Lena shook her head, her eyes haunted. "No, Nikolai, it was me." I know it was. In the days that followed, more of us began seeing things. Shadows in the hallways, strange reflections in the windows, figures that vanished the moment you looked directly at them. It was as if the station itself had become haunted, every corner hiding some unseen presence. I began to avoid looking at my own reflection, afraid of what I might see. The others did the same. We stopped sleeping, our nerves fraying as the days dragged on. Every creak, every whisper of the wind became a source of terror. The atmosphere in the station was thick with dread. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside my door. They stopped, then started again, pacing back and forth. I held my breath, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, a soft knock. Nikolai, the voice was mine. I froze, every muscle tensing as a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Nikolai, it whispered again, my own voice distorted and wrong. Let me in. I clenched my eyes shut, willing the voice to go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved on, fading into silence. I lay there, too terrified to move, waiting for the dawn. Lena was the first to show signs of something. She became withdrawn, her skin pale, her eyes sunken. She stopped eating, stopped talking, just sat in the corner, staring at her reflection in the window. One night she approached me, her voice low and trembling. Nikolai, it's inside me. What are you talking about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me, her eyes hollow. The thing we uncovered. It's inside me, Nikolai. I can feel it, changing me. I didn't know what to say. In my heart, I knew she was right. The discovery had unleashed something ancient, something beyond our understanding. And it was spreading. We knew we had to contain it. The only way was to freeze the station, to lock it back in the ice where it belonged. But that meant sacrificing someone had to stay behind, to ensure the containment, to seal the doors from the inside. Lena volunteered. She said she could feel the entity weakening as the cold set in, as if it thrived on warmth and life. In the end, we left her there, alone in the freezing darkness, her figure a silhouette against the station's dim lights as the doors closed behind us. To this day, I don't know what we found in that ancient ice. I returned to Moscow, carrying the memory of Lena's hollow eyes, of my own face knocking at my door in the dead of night. They say the permafrost is melting faster every year, that ancient pathogens are resurfacing as the ice retreats. I only hope that whatever we found in Siberia stays buried, trapped in the frozen earth. For some things are better left forgotten. My name is Elizabeth Hart. The year was 1912, and I was working as a telegraph operator in a small Alaskan town. That year, the aurora borealis was stronger than anything I'd ever seen. Most nights, the sky was alive with colors that seemed pulled from a dream. I'd always felt lucky to have front row seats to such a spectacle, but I never thought I'd come to fear the lights or what they might be hiding. I had been a wilderness guide for a few years, and during the off-season, I managed the telegraph station, connecting our isolated town to the rest of the world. The pay wasn't much, but I didn't mind. I loved the solitude and the silence, which suited me just fine until that winter night. It started as any other day. Snow piled high outside, and the cold was so sharp that even the breath in my lungs felt frozen. The sun was out, though weak, low on the horizon, casting a soft, dull glow across the landscape. My partner, Daniel, had agreed to accompany me to the telegraph station. He was a sturdy sort, steady and calm, a perfect match for the harsh Alaskan winter. That afternoon, something strange happened. The northern lights, usually reserved for night, began appearing even with the sun still out. It was faint at first, a shimmer, just barely visible. But within minutes, the lights grew brighter, stretching across the sky in curtains of green and violet. It was beautiful, but eerie. A part of me felt a tug of unease, as if we weren't supposed to be watching them at this hour. "What do you make of it?" I asked Daniel, trying to keep my tone light. He squinted at the sky, his brow furrowed. "Never seen anything like it." We both stood there, watching in silence as the lights danced. Then suddenly my compass, a guide's lifeline in these parts, swung wildly in circles, as if it had lost all sense of direction. I tapped it, thinking it might be broken, but it continued spinning, erratic and unsteady. "That's not right," I muttered, glancing back up at the sky. The lights were brighter than ever, twisting and turning in patterns that felt purposeful, almost as if they were alive. Shapes began to form, vague at first, then sharper. I could make out faint outlines, lines that didn't belong to any constellation I knew. Elizabeth, Daniel's voice was tense. We should go inside. Reluctantly, I nodded, and we retreated to the telegraph station. I felt a strange tension in the air, like static building up, pressing down on us. We didn't talk much as we went about our work, but the silence was heavy, filled with an unspoken fear. Night fell quickly in those parts, and by evening the lights had intensified. They seemed to pulse, filling the sky with swirling shapes and colors that no earthly sight should have been able to create. I tried to focus on my work, sending out a message to another operator a few miles south. But there was no response. I repeated the message, louder this time, hoping he'd hear me through the crackling interference. Still, nothing. Looks like the storm's messing with the signal, Daniel said, his voice low. Maybe, I replied, though deep down, I didn't believe it was just a storm. Something felt wrong. The lights shouldn't have been that bright, that close. They almost seemed to be moving with purpose, like something was trying to reach us from the other side of the sky. Then we heard it. A faint humming, low and haunting, drifting down from above. At first I thought it was the wind, but as it grew louder I realized it was something else. The lights outside pulsed in rhythm with the sound, each flash casting strange shadows across the room. I looked at Daniel, my heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, eyes wide. It's coming from the lights." The sound grew louder, a throbbing hum that seemed to vibrate through our bones. I could feel it in my chest, deep and resonant, like the heartbeat of something ancient and powerful. I wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. We were miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence. Suddenly the lights outside shifted, spiraling down toward the ground. They moved like tendrils, reaching out, inching closer with each pulse. Daniel and I backed away from the windows, but there was no escaping the glow that now filled every inch of the room. "What do they want?" I whispered, more to myself than to Daniel. He didn't answer. He just stood there, transfixed, as the lights coiled and twisted outside, casting long shadows across his face. I could see fear in his eyes, but something else too, something like awe. I reached out, grabbed his arm, desperate to pull him away, to get him out of the light. But it was too late. One of the tendrils broke free, snaking through the window like a beam of pure energy. It hovered inches from Daniel, shimmering, shifting, as if studying him. I could feel the air crackling with electricity, every hair on my body standing on end, and then, without warning, the light surged forward, wrapping around him in a blinding flash. He let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing as the light seemed to seep into his skin, filling him from the inside. I tried to reach him, to pull him away, but the force of the light was too strong. I watched, helpless, as he was lifted off the ground, suspended in midair, his face contorted in pain. "Daniel," I screamed, but there was no response. The light tightened its grip, squeezing, pulling, as if it was absorbing him, taking him apart piece by piece. I could see his face, twisted in terror, and I knew there was nothing I could do. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the light released him. He dropped to the floor, limp and lifeless, his skin pale and cold. I rushed to his side, shaking him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, as if he'd seen something beyond human comprehension, something no one should ever witness. I looked up, tears streaming down my face, and saw the lights retreating, pulling back into the sky. They hovered there, pulsing, as if watching me, waiting. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I knew, deep down, that they had spared me. Why, I didn't know. But as they faded into the distance, I felt a weight lift, a release, as if they'd taken something with them, leaving only silence behind. I sat there in the darkness, cradling Daniel's lifeless body, my mind numb with shock and fear. I didn't understand what had happened, or why, but one thing was certain: I would never see the northern lights the same way again. To this day, I can still hear that haunting hum, feel the weight of those ancient eyes watching me from the sky. The lights haven't returned, not like that, but every time I see a faint shimmer on the horizon, my heart races, and I remember that terrible night. I know now that the aurora isn't just light dancing across the sky. It's something older, something powerful, watching, waiting. And though it may spare some, it doesn't always come in peace. My name is Grace Chen, and I've been climbing for as long as I can remember. It was 2008 when the events I'm about to share took place. I was an expert climber and a rescue specialist, living for the thrill of conquering peaks. The chill of the Mount Everest summit had always called to me like a siren's song. On that fateful day, I was preparing for a rescue mission above the death zone, a perilous region where few dared to venture, and even fewer returned. It all began on a dreary Wednesday morning. The skies above Everest were already heavy with clouds, hinting at an incoming storm. I could feel the tension in the air as I gathered my gear. There had been a distress signal, a faint call for help echoing from the summit, a call that seemed impossible to track. It sent chills down my spine. No one should have been up there, not with the weather turning so quickly. I decided to head out, driven by a mixture of duty and an inexplicable urge to uncover the source of the signal. As I climbed higher, the wind howled through the crags and the snow began to fall. Visibility dwindled, but I pressed on, relying on my instincts and training. As I ascended, a sense of unease settled over me. I was alone, my climbing partner having turned back due to the worsening conditions. Every so often, I heard what sounded like whispers carried by the wind. At first, I brushed it off as the storm playing tricks on my mind. But soon, the whispers grew louder, like voices trying to reach me through the chaos. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, and they filled me with an unsettling dread. After several hours of climbing, I stumbled upon an area that seemed oddly serene amid the storm. I found a cluster of tents, surprisingly intact, their flaps gently flapping in the wind. Confused, I approached them cautiously. The sight was surreal. Inside each tent, I found perfectly preserved supplies, climbing gear, food, even warm clothing. It was as if someone had set up camp just moments before the storm, yet there was no one around. I glanced around, my heart racing. It didn't make sense. Why would anyone camp here, above the death zone? Especially when a storm was brewing. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but the pull of mystery kept me rooted to the spot. I scanned the area, hoping to find someone, anyone. But only the howling wind answered me. Then, a sudden chill swept over me, a feeling so intense that I shivered despite the heavy layers I wore. I turned, half expecting to see a fellow climber, but instead, I faced the emptiness of the mountain. That's when I noticed that the tents were arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center stood a large, white room. It was an odd structure, looking as if it had been placed there by a mad architect. The walls were smooth and unblemished, and the door stood slightly ajar, inviting yet forbidding. As if compelled by some unseen force, I moved toward it. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, echoing in my ears. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was different here, thicker, almost electric. The room was stark white, with no windows or furniture, just an overwhelming emptiness that seemed to swallow me whole. The whispers morphed into a low hum, vibrating through the very air around me. I hesitated, my heart racing as I tried to understand what I was feeling. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged within me. I scrambled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The hum intensified, resonating in my bones, and I felt a shift, as if the room was spinning around me, and lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours, and I couldn't tell how long I had been trapped in that space. I fought against the encroaching darkness, shouting for help, but my voice echoed back at me in a mocking tone. I felt as though I was suspended in time, trapped in a loop with no escape. Suddenly, the door creaked open, flooding the room with light. I stumbled out, gasping for air. The storm still raged outside, but everything felt different. The tents were gone, and I was alone on the mountainside. I checked my watch, and my heart dropped. I had lost 3 hours. Confused and terrified, I hurried down the mountain, feeling the weight of my experience heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me, something I couldn't quite grasp. I reached the base camp, breathless and anxious, but when I recounted my story to the other climbers, they looked at me as if I were mad. No one had sent a distress signal. No one had been missing. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on with my life, but the whispers never left me. They followed me into my dreams, haunting my thoughts. I often found myself staring at my climbing gear, wondering what it was that I had experienced. The feeling of unease clung to me like a shadow, reminding me of that chilling encounter in the White Room. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened on that mountain. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and altitude? Or was it something more sinister, something that lurks in the shadows of our reality? I still climb, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that the mountain holds secrets that I may never fully understand. Sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers. They're faint, just at the edge of hearing, but they remind me of that day. I often wonder if they're warnings, or if they are just the echoes of lost souls, trapped in the mountains, forever reaching out for help. I still have my climbing gear, but I can't bring myself to go back to Everest. I don't know if I would survive the next encounter. The mountain feels alive, and I know it watches me, waiting for my return. My name is Maria Santos, and the year this all happened was 1962. I was working as a fire lookout in California during one of the most tense periods in American history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The mountains stood tall and quiet, shrouded in pine trees, and the air was crisp, carrying a mix of tranquility and an undercurrent of unease. I had spent years monitoring these forests, and I took pride in my job. My little lookout tower stood alone on a ridge, far from the bustling world below, where I could see for miles. One evening, as I prepared for another long night, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the landscape. I settled into my routine, scanning the horizon with my binoculars, marking any signs of smoke or fire on my chart. I felt safe here, miles away from the looming tensions of the Cold War. But as night fell and the stars began to twinkle, something caught my eye, a flicker of light in the distance. At first I thought it was a campfire, perhaps some hikers setting up for the night. But then I noticed it was odd. It flickered in a pattern, like a signal. I adjusted my binoculars, straining to see what it could be. The flames danced against the wind, but the direction of the smoke was unnatural, almost as if they were moving against the breeze. As I continued to watch, I began to see more fires springing up, all arranged in a bizarre, swirling pattern. Each signal fire seemed to communicate something, but I couldn't decipher the meaning. I felt a chill run down my spine. The further I looked, the more the flames twisted, forming symbols that looked almost like warnings. My heart raced as I wrote down the coordinates, trying to make sense of it all. I reached for the radio, but static filled the air, making communication impossible. I had always been alone up here, but tonight felt different, like I was being watched. I felt a presence, heavy and cold, pressing against my chest. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the tower, echoing my unease. I shook off the feeling and focused again on the fires. What could they mean? I wished I had someone to talk to, someone to share this with. But as the night dragged on, I felt increasingly isolated. The fires continued their cryptic dance, and I started to see figures in the shadows, flitting just beyond the edge of the light. With every passing hour, the symbols grew more complex, more defined. I felt drawn to them, as if they were calling me. I didn't want to admit it, but fear gripped me. There was something wrong, something that transcended the simple threat of a forest fire. This was not just an accident or a group of campers lost in the woods. It felt like a message from something ancient and powerful. Then, without warning, I heard a soft whispering. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling the leaves, but then it grew louder, forming words that I couldn't quite understand. Panic washed over me. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it into the trees surrounding my tower, but there was nothing there, just the darkness staring back. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the stress of the crisis had finally gotten to me, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I felt it in my bones, a primal instinct that urged me to act. I climbed up to the observation deck, desperate for a better view of the fires. The lights flickered and shifted, a strange rhythm now playing out before me. I gasped as I saw a figure step into the light, its form distorted and shifting like the flames. I froze, unable to look away. It was a tall silhouette, crowned by a flame-like halo, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, and I realized they were not just words, they were voices, overlapping and urgent, pleading for attention. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying. The figure beckoned me with a slow, deliberate motion, and I was torn between the urge to flee and the urge to step forward. In that moment, I understood what it wanted. This entity, this fire spirit born from the fear of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, was using the crisis to manifest itself. It was feeding on the dread that hung in the air, and if I didn't act, it would spread beyond the mountains into the populated areas below. I snapped out of my trance and realized I needed to prevent this from escalating. Grabbing my radio again, I tried to call for help, but the static was relentless. I was utterly alone. The fires were reaching their climax, the cymbals pulsating like a heartbeat. I had only one option. I needed to redirect its energy, push it back into the ocean where it could do no harm. I closed my eyes, focusing on every ounce of strength I had left. "Leave this place," I shouted, my voice cutting through the chaos. "You don't belong here." The fires roared in response, the entity's eyes narrowing. For a moment it seemed to hesitate, as if weighing my words. I seized the opportunity, raising my arms toward the sky, channeling every ounce of willpower I could muster. "Go back to the sea," I cried out, imagining the entity being pulled from the land, like a tide retreating from the shore. With a sudden rush, the flames began to swirl violently, the patterns breaking apart, spiraling downwards. I felt a surge of hope, but just as quickly it was replaced by dread as the entity turned its gaze towards me, its whispers transforming into a roar that echoed through the mountains. The lights flickered, and I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. Suddenly, the fires erupted in a blinding flash, and I was thrown back against the wall of the tower. When I regained my senses, the figure was gone, and the fires had extinguished themselves, leaving nothing but smoke and silence. I rushed to the edge of the tower, peering out into the darkness, heart pounding. I did it. I stopped it, at least for now. But as the smoke began to clear, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The winds shifted, carrying the whispers away, but I knew deep down that the entity could return. After that night, I never stayed in that tower again. I moved back to the city, away from the mountains, but I still think of it often. The sight of flames still sends a chill through me, and sometimes late at night I hear those whispers again, faint and distant, echoing through the dark. I never told anyone what happened. They would think I was crazy, a paranoid lookout too influenced by the fear of the times. But I know the truth: there are forces out there, ancient and powerful, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I fear they might just find their way back. My name is Samuel Wilson, and I'm not one for sharing tales, especially ones that sound like they came out of some dime novel. But this story? This one I think folks need to hear. This all happened back in the summer of 1934, right in the heart of Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. If you've never been through a drought like that, I don't know if I can properly explain what it does to a person. The earth had been so parched it seemed to crack and crumble underfoot. The skies hung heavy, but it was as if they'd forgotten how to cry. For miles around, everything looked dead. The rivers dried up, the lakes turned to cracked clay. Livestock was dropping from thirst, and families were abandoning their homes to look for better land. I was a forest ranger back then, tasked with checking on the sparse wooded areas left in our region. But there wasn't much to see, just acres of dry, dying land. One scorching July afternoon, I was called out to Cedar Lake. It used to be one of the largest water sources around, but had been reduced to nothing more than a dried-up basin with deep cracks spidering through the mud like veins on an old man's hands. I'd been asked to check the lake bed for any signs of water or life. They didn't expect much, but we all still had a duty to the land, even if it was crumbling beneath us. I remember the crunch of my boots on the dry earth as I walked toward the middle of that vast, empty pit. I thought I'd seen deep cracks in the ground before, but nothing like this. These were unnatural, almost as if something had clawed its way out from beneath. Some of them went down so far that even with the sun overhead, I couldn't see the bottom. I tossed a pebble into one, just to hear it clink its way down, but the sound didn't even echo back. It felt like a void, empty, hungry. I shrugged it off and continued my rounds, but the image of those dark fissures kept nagging at me. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see them there in my mind, like open wounds in the earth. At the time, I chalked it up to exhaustion. The heat had been relentless, and I figured I was just tired. A few days later, I got a call from a nearby farm. The farmer, a man named Harvey, was losing livestock. His cows were vanishing, just gone without a trace. Coyotes, maybe, I thought, were thieves. But he told me it was stranger than that. He said he'd found tracks, leading from his field right up to one of those cracks in the lake bed. Then, nothing. Just empty space, like the earth had swallowed them whole. I didn't know what to make of it, but I agreed to check it out. When I got there, I found the tracks Harvey had mentioned, hoof prints, heading straight toward the edge of one of those deep fissures. I knelt down to take a closer look, and that's when I saw its scratch marks around the rim, as if something with claws had dragged the cow down into the earth. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't say anything. Harvey looked at me with wide, desperate eyes, and I didn't want to add to his fears. I just told him I'd keep an eye on things and walked back to my truck. Over the next week, more reports came in. Livestock from nearby farms was vanishing, always near one of those cracks. I started patrolling the area more frequently, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was that was causing the disappearances. But every time I went out, all I found were more tracks leading to those endless pits. The farmers were on edge, and some even started packing up to leave. One night just after sundown, I decided to stake out near one of the deeper cracks, hoping that whatever was taking the animals would make an appearance. I brought along my old rifle, not really expecting to need it, but feeling better with it by my side. The air was thick and hot, and the silence was so heavy that it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I sat there for hours, my eyes scanning the horizon, watching shadows stretch across the cracked ground as the moon rose high overhead. Just when I was about to give up and head back, I heard a low, rumbling noise coming from the earth itself. I could feel the ground vibrating beneath me, like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. I watched in horror as one of the cracks widened right before my eyes, splitting open, as if something massive was pushing up from below. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood there frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. Then, in the dim moonlight, I saw something moving in the shadows near the crack. It was massive, with a long, sinuous body that seemed to flow like liquid over the ground. Its skin was rough and covered in scales, like a serpent. But its head was wrong. It had these deep-set eyes that seemed to burn in the dark, and a wide mouth lined with teeth that glistened in the moonlight. It moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, and I realized with a sickening dread that it was hunting. I don't know what it was about that thing that kept me rooted in place, but I couldn't move. I watched as it slid down into one of the cracks, disappearing into the earth as if it belonged there. When it was gone, the crack closed up behind it, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. I stood there in stunned silence, the echoes of that rumbling heartbeat still reverberating in my bones. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to go back to the lake bed. I tried to tell the others what I'd seen, but they looked at me like I was crazy. Harvey packed up and left, and soon after the other farmers followed. Cedar Lake became a ghost town, and eventually I stopped going out there altogether. But sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is silent, I can still feel the faintest tremor in the earth beneath my feet. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, biding its time beneath the cracked, parched ground, hungering for the rain to come and bring it back to life. And every once in a while, I think I see it in my dreams, that shadowy figure with burning eyes, watching, waiting. Maybe it was the drought that woke it, or maybe it's been here all along, hidden beneath the dust and the clay, waiting for the right moment to rise again. All I know is that there are things buried in the earth, things older and hungrier than we can imagine. And sometimes, when the earth opens up, it's not just the water it's waiting for. My name is Sarah Chen. Back in 1957, I worked as a park ranger in a thick forest in Montana. I took the job after my younger brother, Billy, passed away in the Korean War. Billy and I had been close. He was like my shadow, always by my side growing up. Losing him left me feeling empty, and I thought working in the quiet of the forest would help me heal. That summer, Montana was going through a brutal heat wave. The air was heavy and hot, and everything smelled strongly of pine sap. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for the weather to change. I'd been there for a few months, and most of my days were quiet, filled with the usual patrols and hikes. Then, one day I found something strange. I was walking down one of the forest trails, checking the area, when I noticed a circle on the ground, a perfect circle of pine needles. It was about 3 feet across. At first I thought it was nothing, maybe an animal or the wind. But it looked too perfect, like someone had placed each needle carefully. I thought it might be a prank, maybe some kids messing around, even though it didn't make much sense for anyone to be all the way out here. I shook it off and went on with my patrol. But that day I saw more of those circles. Some were big, some small, but all of them were perfectly round, with the pine needles placed just so. When I got back to the ranger station, I mentioned it to George, the other ranger on duty. He was an older guy, quiet, didn't talk much. When I told him about the circles, he looked at me for a moment and just shrugged. "The kids," he said. Don't think too much of it, but the way he looked at me, it was like he knew something he didn't want to say. I tried to forget about it, but the circle stayed in my mind. A few days later, I was out on the trail again, near sunset. The forest was quiet, and the air felt thick. That's when I heard a voice, soft and far away, calling my name. Sarah. Gus. I stopped, trying to listen. It was so faint that I thought maybe it was just the wind. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. Sarah, come here. It was Billy's voice. I stood there, frozen. I hadn't heard Billy's voice in years, but I knew it right away. My heart started pounding, and I told myself it was just a memory, a trick of the mind. But the voice came again, calling me. Sarah, come here. I didn't know what to think. It couldn't be Billy, he was gone. But I felt my feet moving, slowly, down the trail toward the voice. It was like something was pulling me, and I couldn't stop myself. I walked deeper into the forest, the trees getting closer, darker. Then, right there in the middle of the trail, I saw another circle of pine needles. This one was the biggest I'd seen yet, perfectly round, lying in the middle of the path. My heart was pounding, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked around, but the forest was empty, just shadows and trees. The voice came again, but softer now, like it was moving away from me, deeper into the woods. Sarah, come find me. I wanted to run back, to turn around and go back to the station, but something held me there, like the forest was watching me, waiting. The voice stopped, and the silence was thick. I looked around, feeling like I was being watched. The trees were just shadows in the dim light, but it felt like they were alive, looking at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Billy's voice in my head, calling my name. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks, but I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I decided to go back to the spot. I told myself I just wanted to check, to make sure it was all in my head. But part of me knew I was hoping to hear the voice again. As I walked down the trail, the forest felt different. The air was thicker, like it was pressing down on me. The smell of pine was strong, almost sickening. I walked slowly, looking for any sign of those strange circles, but the trail looked normal. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again. The whisper. This time it was closer, right behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just trees. The voice came again, soft and almost sad. Sarah, Demniastu. I stumbled back, my hand reaching out to steady myself. I looked down and realized I was standing in another circle, even bigger than the last one. And then I saw something moving through the trees, a shadow, tall and thin, slipping between the trunks. It was silent, just a shape in the dark, but I could feel it watching me. I wanted to run, to get away, but I couldn't move. It felt like the forest itself was holding me there, pressing down on me. The shadow raised its arm, pointing towards something behind me, and I felt a chill so deep it cut through the heat. I turned, slowly, and saw another shadow, smaller, standing just a few feet away. It looked like Billy, his shape, his stance, even the tilt of his head. But when I looked closer, I saw his face was blank, like a dark, empty mask. The whisper came again, so close it felt like it was inside my head. Sarah, come with us. I don't remember how I got out of there. I just remember running, tearing through the trees, feeling the branches scratching my arms, the ground slippery beneath my feet. The whisper followed me, growing louder, filling my mind until it was everywhere, inside and outside. When I finally broke out of the trees and made it back to the open field, the voice stopped. The silence was so thick it hurt my ears. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding. But I knew it wasn't over. The forest had let me go, but I could feel it, like it was still watching me, waiting. A week later, I quit my job. I told my boss it was the heat, the stress, anything I could think of. But I knew the real reason. I couldn't go back into that forest, knowing something was waiting there, something that wore my brother's voice like a mask. Sometimes, even now, I hear it. Late at night, when I'm alone, I hear that whisper, soft and far away, calling my name. And every time I wonder if it's really Billy, or something else, something that wants me to come back. My name is Thomas Blackwood. This story took place in 1885 in the shadowy wilds of the Appalachian Mountains. I'd been a trail guide for as long as I could remember, growing up learning every tree, stream, and ridge from my father. By 20, I knew the paths well enough to navigate them blindfolded. People from towns far off would come to me for guidance, believing I had a sense for the land. Maybe it was true, or maybe I just knew where not to tread. It was late fall when I got a strange request from a small group of travelers who wanted to cross a patch of the Appalachian wilderness no one had mapped yet. Normally, I'd refuse. There were places in those woods even I avoided. But they offered me enough coin to get through the winter, so I took it. We were 5 in total myself, 2 men named David and Carl, a woman named Lillian, and a professor called Jebediah, who seemed to be the leader. Our first few days were uneventful. We followed deer trails and stepped over thick roots, the usual sights and sounds of the forest surrounding us. But on the 3rd day, something felt wrong. The birds had gone silent, and the air felt heavy, like we'd stumbled into a place that didn't want us. I shrugged it off, but as we pressed further into the wilderness, I noticed strange markers carved into trees along our path. The carvings weren't like any I'd seen: swirls, lines, and symbols I couldn't understand. They looked old, like they'd been there for generations, and had been carved with an intent that went beyond mere navigation. I didn't say anything at first, not wanting to spook the others. But as we moved deeper, the markers began to appear more frequently. They were scattered on trees, rocks, and even in the dirt, arranged in patterns I couldn't decipher. On the 5th night, as we sat around our fire, I finally mentioned them to the group. Jebediah's eyes lit up with curiosity, asking if I'd ever seen markings like these before. No, I said, my voice low. And I've been guiding these trails my whole life. The others grew quiet, the flickering fire casting strange shadows over their faces. Lillian spoke up, saying she'd felt something watching us since we'd entered this part of the forest. David and Carl laughed it off, saying it was probably just animals, but their nervous glances told me they felt it too. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, feeling like something was standing just beyond the edge of our camp. Each time I looked, there was nothing there, only the stillness of the forest and those strange trail markers gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, as we broke camp, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The markers that had been ahead of us were now behind us, as if they'd moved overnight. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I'd seen those same markings, but now they were leading us back the way we'd come, only we hadn't turned around. I kept quiet, guiding us forward, but the unease in my gut grew heavier with each step. The others began to notice too. Jebediah tried to reassure everyone, but even he looked unsettled. As we pressed further, the trail markers seemed to multiply, appearing on both sides of us, creating a corridor of strange symbols. I'd never felt so lost in my own territory. The paths twisted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, leading us in circles. Carl started to panic, muttering that the forest was playing tricks on us. The others tried to calm him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. By the time we made camp that night, the fear had seeped into all of us. No one spoke much, and we kept the fire blazing high, as if it could keep whatever was lurking in the woods at bay. But even the fire couldn't keep the shadows away. Every now and then I'd catch movement at the edge of the light, a flash of something that looked almost human, but not quite. A hunched shape that vanished before I could get a good look. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning I found something that left me shaken to my core. A new marker had appeared near our campsite, but this one wasn't like the others. It looked fresh, recently carved, with a small pile of stones arranged beneath it. The stones formed a perfect circle, and in the center lay a bundle of twisted sticks and leaves, tied together with a piece of animal sinew. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was some kind of offering, though for what, I didn't know. I tried to get us to turn back, but Jebediah insisted we press on. He said we were close to something significant, though he wouldn't say what. The others were too frightened to argue, so we followed him, deeper into the twisted heart of the forest. That evening, as we stumbled upon another clearing, I saw something that froze me in place. In the center of the clearing stood a tall, twisted figure, cloaked in shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but I could tell it was watching us, its gaze piercing through the gloom. It didn't move, just stood there, like it was waiting. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to any of us, I heard it whisper, "Leave." I turned to the others, but they were staring in horror at the figure too. Jebediah took a step forward, his eyes wide with fascination, but I grabbed his arm, whispering that we needed to go. Now. He hesitated, but the fear in my eyes must have convinced him. We turned and fled, leaving the clearing behind. As we stumbled back through the forest, I realized with horror that the trail markers were now leading us in every direction, as if the forest itself was trapping us. No matter which way we turned, the same symbols appeared, mocking us. I knew then that we weren't alone, that something was guiding us, leading us deeper into its domain. Hours passed, maybe even days. I lost track of time as we wandered, exhaustion setting in. Carl and Lillian grew weaker, their eyes hollow with fear. Jebediah mumbled to himself, his fascination replaced with dread. And then, one night, the forest grew deathly silent. We huddled together, our backs against a tree, clutching whatever weapons we could find. In the darkness, I could feel it drawing closer, that twisted figure from the clearing. I could hear its footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. The others heard it too, their breaths shallow and quick. It stopped just outside our circle, and I dared a glance. It was closer now, close enough that I could see the hollow pits where its eyes should have been, and the twisted smile that stretched across its face. It was a trickster spirit, one of the old ones from forgotten legends, a being that thrived on fear and confusion. In a moment of clarity, I remembered an old story my father had told me, a story about how to trap such an entity. I gathered my courage and reached into my pack, pulling out a handful of salt and scattering it in a circle around us. The creature paused, its expression twisting with anger. It lunged forward, but the salt seemed to hold it at bay, its form flickering like a dying flame. I realized then that it wanted me, that it had been guiding us here, to this very spot. I took a deep breath, stepping forward as the others watched in horror. "Go," I told them. "I'll hold it here." They protested, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the desperate need to escape. Finally, they turned and ran, their footsteps fading into the darkness. As I stood there, alone with the creature, I whispered the words my father had taught me, an old prayer meant to bind spirits to the earth. The creature shrieked, its form distorting and writhing, but I held my ground, repeating the words over and over until it began to fade. In the end, I don't remember much. I blacked out, and when I woke up, I was alone. The forest was silent, the trail markers gone, as if they had never been there at all. I found my way back to town, but I never saw the others again. I can only hope they made it out safely. As for me, I left the trail guiding business for good, haunted by the memory of that twisted figure in the clearing and the knowledge that some things in those woods were never meant to be found. When I first set foot on Mount McKinley, I could never have imagined how terrifying solitude in the cold could become. I was here on a research mission, documenting climate anomalies, and I had been granted the role of leading the research team, a team of two, myself and a geophysicist named Dr. Aria Liu. We were stationed at the remote research outpost for a full winter. As a glaciologist, I was used to braving harsh conditions, but the sheer isolation up here was something else entirely. It was the polar night, and once the sun dipped below the horizon, it didn't rise again. The darkness swallowed everything, creating a kind of permanent twilight that wore on our nerves. The wind seemed alive, howling and screaming outside the thick walls of the station. Sometimes, it sounded like something was clawing to get in. We'd been here for 2 months, carefully logging ice core samples from the glacier, trying to piece together some mystery in the Earth's ancient climate records. Everything was going smoothly until one day in late December, when we drilled a little deeper than usual, pulling up an ice core sample from an unusually dark layer. The core looked odd, the kind of thing that makes your instincts turn a little sour. "Dr. Wells, do you see that?" Aria pointed to the core in the sample holder, her gloved hand hovering just above the ice. "Look at the color. It's almost black. I've never seen a sample like this." She was right. The ice had a grayish tint, almost like ash trapped within. For some reason, it sent a chill down my spine, a strange reaction given that I was literally surrounded by ice. We analyzed the sample in our lab, and as we melted down a small section to study its contents, I noticed tiny particles suspended in the liquid under the microscope. Organisms, or so it seemed. The implications of that discovery were groundbreaking: organisms preserved in ice for thousands, maybe millions of years. It could change what we knew about life on Earth. But as we gazed through the microscopes, I felt an odd sense of dread, as if those microscopic creatures were watching me back. "What do you think they are?" I asked, trying to shake the feeling. "I'm not sure," Arya replied. "But if these organisms survived all this time, it means they've adapted to something we might not fully understand." That night, something changed. The temperatures outside, which were already unforgiving, plummeted to an abnormal low. It was so cold that the walls of the station began to groan and pop, as if protesting against the freezing weight pressing in from outside. We could feel the cold seeping through, despite the heating system running at full blast. Our communications were the next thing to go. One moment, we were in the middle of a radio call with headquarters, and the next, the line went dead. We tried every channel, every piece of equipment, but there was only silence. At first we told ourselves it was just technical interference, a common enough problem out here. But there was a strange quality to that silence. It was heavy, almost tangible, pressing down on us like a warning. We sat in silence, occasionally glancing at the door as if expecting someone, or something, to knock. And then came the footsteps. The first night we heard them faintly soft, deliberate steps crunching over the frozen ground outside the station. At first I thought it was just the wind shifting ice. But then we heard it again, closer this time and slow. I shared a look with Arya, her wide eyes mirroring my own unease. "It could be a snow fox," I said, trying to sound convincing. She nodded, but her face betrayed her fear. We both knew no animal would come so close to the station, not in these conditions. The following day, we found odd tracks in the snow just outside our station door. They were unlike anything I'd seen. Long, slender indentations trailed by a scattering of claw marks. The tracks led up to the station's entrance, stopping right at the door. And then, nothing. No return trail, no evidence of an animal moving away. Maybe it flew off, Arya suggested, but her voice sounded hollow. "Flew," I echoed, my skepticism thinly veiled. "In this storm." Arya said nothing, her gaze fixed on the dark line where the tracks vanished into the snow. I didn't push it, but I could tell that she was rattled. And I felt it too, an odd, gnawing feeling that something was not right. The nights grew colder, and the silence thicker. The tracks appeared every few days, always leading to the door, sometimes even circling the station, as if whatever it was outside was trying to find a way in. Then, about a week later, something changed in the air. Arya woke me up in the dead of night, her face pale, her body shaking. "Marcus." "Something scratching at the walls." I sat up, heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't hear anything but the blood rushing in my ears. Then, faintly, I caught the sound scraping, like claws dragging along the metal exterior of the station. "Stay here," I whispered. "I'm going to check the cameras." I made my way down the narrow corridor to the monitoring room, my mind racing. It was probably just snow shifting, I told myself. But deep down, I didn't believe it. As I scanned the security feeds, I caught a glimpse of movement near the northern wall, but the camera feed flickered, and I lost it. When the feed returned, everything was still. Whatever had been there was gone. The next morning, we found claw marks on the northern side of the station, deep scratches etched into the metal. Whatever had done this had strength beyond anything normal. We continued our work in silence, avoiding the windows, barely speaking. The sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing day. And then, just as the silence had become unbearable, we heard its soft breathing, close, right outside the door. We froze. I could feel Arya's hand gripping my arm as we listened to the shallow, rasping breaths. It sounded almost human. But not quite. There was a roughness to it, an animalistic edge that sent chills through my bones. We didn't sleep that night. Neither of us spoke. We just sat, listening, waiting for something to happen.